Okay, good afternoon, everyone. I would like to start by thanking each one of you for taking the time to join us today. We were disappointed that we couldn't hold an event in person because of the snow, but we're so happy to have you here with us today to learn from Lisa Fontes. First, I'd like to extend our thanks to the Sudbury Foundation for their generous grant, First Parish and Reverend Bennett, who generously agreed to host, Carlin Gruber for help with this webinar, and especially Mary Ann Borkowski, my colleague who did the lion's share of the work in organizing this workshop. I'd also like to thank the town of Wayland, our town manager, and my HRDIC, or Human Rights, Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Committee members who believe in and supported this workshop for our town. Thank you also to TREC, our statewide coalition working on legislation, the Sudbury, Wayland, Lincoln, BV Roundtable, MFAC, DVSN, REACH, JDW, and the many other organizations who helped us spread word about this event. I just wanted to make a quick request. We did not ask anyone to register for this event, but we would love to have your contact information so that we can send you a link to this recording, as well as a collection of important articles on coercive control, including some by Lisa Fontes. If you could please click on the link that will be dropped into the chat now. We would appreciate if you could just fill out your name and your contact information. Thank you. Also, during the presentation, please feel free to drop any questions that you have for Lisa into the chat. And then after the presentation, we'll have an extended Q&A, and you'll also have the opportunity to raise your hand and ask questions then. We are excited to be able to share Lisa's workshop with the public, and I know that there are people here from many other communities as well. The vision for this workshop was to invite leaders from all parts of Wayland, as well as interested town residents and survivors, and to see how this knowledge impacts our community over time. We hope that participants may act on their new knowledge and share it with their friends, family, and the organizations that they work with. Will they have the opportunity to support survivors? How much change can awareness raising bring within one community? If even one person's life is changed as a result of the months planning this workshop, it will be worth it. But I hope it will accomplish much more. Domestic abuse, otherwise known as coercive control, has long been a taboo topic. However, in order for victims, for survivors to get the support that they need to escape abuse, we need to be able to have these conversations. We need the knowledge to be able to support survivors because they are purposefully isolated by their abusers. And the more that we understand the subtle and complex dynamics of abuse, the more we can do to protect ourselves, our children, and our communities from this scourge. I think that those who are not in the field do not realize how pervasive it is and how many patriarchal structures in society help to maintain the practice of abuse and fail to create accountability for abusers. I think about the statistic of 1 in 3 women globally who experience physical abuse in their lifetime. We know that abuse is also drastically underreported. When we include other forms of abuse and control, this number will be closer to 1 in 2 women. What does this mean for our friends, our families, our communities, for the future of our children? It does mean that every one of us has many survivors in our networks, but we likely do not know it because they are so fearful of breaking the silence. The risk is too great. I will stop here because we are here to learn from Lisa Fontes. Lisa is a groundbreaking figure in the field of domestic abuse and coercive control and a senior lecturer at UMass Amherst. He wrote the cutting-edge book, Invisible Chains, Overcoming Coercive Control in Your Intimate Relationships, back in 2015. With a doctorate in psychology, Lisa has over 25 years of experience working on domestic abuse, child abuse, and cross-cultural research. And she is recognized nationwide for her expertise on coercive control. She has also worked globally, from Kenya to Chile, which includes training prosecutors on coercive control, week-long workshops on forensic interviewing for child abuse, and has supervised child protection workers, police, psychotherapists, prosecutors, and school welfare personnel. She also works as a consultant and expert witness to survivors in family court, which remains one of the only avenues that abusers have to still control their victims post-separation. I'm so grateful to have her here with us today So without further ado, I welcome Dr. Lisa Fontes.
Thank you so much, Wayland. I am very happy to be here today and to speak about this really important and really interesting topic. And I do want to warn people that what I'm going to be talking about is difficult. And especially for people who have a history of trauma themselves or who know people who do, it may be difficult. So please do what you need to do to take care of yourself. Take a sip of water, turn away, take a deep breath, whatever you might need to do to take care of yourself. And I hope this will be beneficial to all. So the plan for our time together is I'm going to be defining and describing coercive control, which is a familiar term for some people, but an unfamiliar term for many people. I'm going to be talking about how gender fits in. I'll be talking about the ways in which coercive control harms children. I'll be touching on post-separation abuse. I'll be speaking about laws on coercive control, including the proposed laws in Massachusetts. And we'll be having some time at the end for your questions, your comments, and your disagreements. Even though we do have a fair amount of time together, since I've been working on this for so many years, it does feel to me almost like picking from a buffet, and there's so much more that could be said. So I hope this will be in some ways the beginning of a conversation which we can continue in a variety of ways into the future. I do want to give a big thank you first to Mei-Ling Ellerman, who has done so much to make this happen, and Marianne Barkowski. I want to thank the town of Wayland and its Human Rights, Diversity, Equity, Inclusion Committee, the Wayland Police and Fire Department, who I understand have representatives here. They are so important in the response to domestic violence. The League of Women Voters, the Sudbury Wayland Domestic Violence Roundtable, Wayland Town Manager Michael McCall, the Domestic Violence Services Network, and folks from the Wayland Public Schools, who I hope are also here with us. And I want to thank Evan Stark. Evan Stark is the sociologist and professor of social work who brought the idea of coercive control, which had been previously part of the literature on cults. And in his brilliant book, Coercive Control, How Men Entrap Women in Personal Life in 2008, brought it into the world of domestic violence. That book has been reprinted. You can see that in the middle there. There's a second edition. And just recently, really within the last month, he came out with a book called Children of Coercive Control, which I'll be talking about in greater length later. And I really want to thank you. I want to thank you for taking the time to be with us here today. So let me start by differentiating between psychological abuse and coercive control, because a lot of times people think they're the same thing, and they're not. Psychological abuse could be one incident or multiple incidents. So for instance, if somebody berates their partner and criticizes them once terribly, that could be psychological abuse. Or there could be repeated incidents, but it's all of one type. So demeaning them verbally, or making them afraid verbally, or threatening them verbally. Psychological abuse could be ongoing, so it could be happening daily or almost daily, or there could be periodic isolated incidents, maybe when the abuser is drinking or drugging, let's say, or having an episode of a mental illness. Those would all be forms of psychological abuse. Coercive control is different. Coercive control has numerous incidents in a multi-pronged strategy. And we'll be talking more about what I mean by that. In other words, there are various forms of abuse that are happening. It occurs over time, and part of the harm of coercive control is that it does occur over time. So some of these incidents, if they happened, just once or twice, maybe it wouldn't be so bad. But it occurs again and again over a period of time and really wears a person down. It can include physical, emotional, economic, sexual, legal, and other forms of abuse that we'll be looking at. And the target is deprived of resources, whether those resources are friends, money, transportation, the ability to speak up. The victim becomes trapped. I'm using the term victim, victim survivor, and target here. And in the question and answer period, I'm happy to speak about why we might use one term or the other. So coercive control is a strategy that some people use to control their intimate partner. It can and does exist in some same-sex couples, and I have worked on cases with same-sex couples. Peoples of all genders can be victimized and victimizers. In heterosexual couples, it's more often men over women, and we'll be looking today at some of the reasons why that's true. And I should say that most men would never control their partners in this way. So coercive control isn't really ordinary daily kinds of expecting a partner to do a little more housework, let's say. It is something much more pernicious. Coercive control is domestic violence. In the 1980s, activists in the domestic violence field tried to get the courts and the police to understand that someone getting punched or kicked at home, getting, their eye socket shattered or a broken bone, black and blue marks, was as serious as somebody being harmed in these ways in a bar. And so in the public imagination, in the mind and in the laws, a lot of times, people thought of domestic violence as episodes of getting punched, getting kicked, getting hit. And that was certainly helpful to have the police and the laws take harm, physical harm that happened in the home seriously. But the model of coercive control is more comprehensive and I think a lot better. In the model of coercive control, we say domestic violence is not simply episodes of violence. There's a whole universe of behaviors that make up coercive control, and episodes of violence are a small part of that universe. We'll be looking at the other things that make up the universe of coercive control. Isolating, abusing sexually, intimidating, economic abuse, degrading, stalking, abusing through technology, abusing physically, manipulating, controlling through children, micromanaging, and more. Not all of these have to be present, but more than one of them are present in coercive control. So you might think about coercive control as being the torment that happens between reportable domestic violence incidents. Let's say on January 1st, a husband punches his wife, okay? Maybe she would call the police, maybe she wouldn't, or maybe a neighbor would call. And then on July 1st, let's say a husband kicks his wife, and maybe somebody would call and maybe somebody wouldn't call. But it's not that nothing happened between January 1st and July 1st. A whole universe of dominating behaviors happened, and that is what we call coercive control. Coercive control harms children too, and every tactic named here also harms children. We'll be looking at that some. I want to start with the idea of love bombing or trapping someone through acts of love, because sometimes you might meet someone and say, but why are they with this abuser? You need to know that it doesn't usually start that way. It usually starts with an incredible outpouring of romantic love, which is very entrapping. Coercive control relationships usually start in a whirlwind with intense pressure early on for sex and for commitment. Now, as part of my work as an expert witness in domestic violence and coercive control cases, I usually take a history of the relationship. And so often, not always, but so often, the person will describe, I was swept off my feet. Before I knew it, he'd moved in. 2 weeks into our relationship, he was on my bank account. He said he loved me, and I didn't really feel that way, but I felt like I had to say that back. So there's this moving before the person who's been targeted even really can figure out what's going on. The Crown Prosecution Service in the United Kingdom this April recognized love bombing as part of a coercive control dynamic. The love bombing doesn't just occur in the beginning of the relationship. It can occur whenever the abuser thinks that the victim is trying to get away or thinking of getting away. So I think of it not as a cycle, but as kind of a toolbox. The abuser has a toolbox of techniques or tactics to keep the victim survivor in the relationship. And sometimes they'll use isolation, sometimes they'll use the threat of physical violence, and sometimes they'll use acts of love. So they may take out the wedding album, or take her out to a nice meal, or give her a gift, or cry and promise to change in order to keep the victim trapped in the relationship. If you're in law enforcement or when you work in the courts, you may be frustrated because so often victims of domestic abuse do not want to testify against their abuser, and charges may be dropped. It may be because the abuser is presenting as repentant and loving. It may be because the person feels threatened or is afraid to lose their home, and there's other possible reasons too. But I do think we have to keep these acts of love in mind as an abusive tactic. Isolating is very common and is a very clear red flag of a coercive control relationship. So the abuser will separate their target from their family and friends and coworkers. And that can happen in a variety of ways. It can be just, honey, let's put our telephones on up in the closet all weekend and not talk to anybody and just be by ourselves. Or it could be bad-mouthing the friends, or it could be bad-mouthing the target to the friends, or it could be putting her in a situation where she feels like she has to quit her job, or it could be packaged as caring. So like, honey, I don't want you to go out running because you're trying to get pregnant and that might interfere. Or, honey, I want you to stop that class you're taking because you're sitting next to strangers and it's not really safe for you to go downtown. Or I just want to go with you to the supermarket every time you go because I can't get enough of you and I don't want you to be by yourself. Before you know it, the person who's being victimized is increasingly isolated. What this means is if at some point that victim survivor wants to get away, they may be very isolated. Without contact with their friends, with their family. They may not have a job. They may not be in touch with their neighbors. A lot of times people in a coercive control relationship will cut some of their contacts themselves because it just doesn't feel safe to maintain relationships with other people, or it's just not worth it. Let's say the abuser says, sure, you can go see your sister. But then she comes home from being with her sister and the abuser says, why did you choose to go with her rather than me? Well, the person who's being victimized learns it's just not worth trying to have friendships. It's just not worth trying to have other people in my life because it's too much of a hassle. And so the victim becomes quite isolated. Often the abuser will create economic dependency. So the abuser may not allow the victim to work, or will force her to quit, or will arrange things so she gets fired. This may, be or feel like a mutual decision. A lot of women, if they have the possibility of doing so, may quit working when they have children. But there are ways to do this that are cooperative and truly a mutual decision. And there are ways to do this that create a dependency in someone who's being victimized. Maybe the victim will have an allowance, which is supposed to cover all kinds of things that the allowance really is insufficient to cover. I have seen money used to threaten and to reward and to punish in both wealthy families and low-income families. The abuser may ruin the victim's credit, so may push her to maximize all her credit cards or take out loans. So that if she tries to get away, it's harder for her to get away. The abuser will frequently blame the victim survivor for her dependence. So, you just sit on your lazy rear end all day while I'm going out and working. Even if it's the abuser who pushed for that kind of economic dependence. But in some coercive control relationships, it's the victim who works. Maybe both members of the couple work, or maybe even just the victim works. Victims are typically forced or pressed to turn over their earnings, put them in our joint account, but then she doesn't have access to the joint account without the abuser's permission. Abusers will typically put the victim's job at risk and interfere with her advancement. The abuser may steal from the partner. The abuser may require or push the victim to pay for his schooling or equipment for a job or a car and promise to pay back, but then never get around to paying back. And then, as many people know, unfortunately, after a divorce or separation, the abuser will typically try to claim everything financial, everything that they own, any assets. Manipulating is another tactic of coercive control, and there's many ways to manipulate another person or an intimate partner, including lying to that person, not telling the truth about their identity, their debts, their job, their previous marriage, the number of children they have, not allowing the victim to have privacy. I've worked with multiple people who were not allowed to close the door when they used the bathroom, or the abuser even took the door off the bathroom. Abusers will use the silent treatment as a way to punish their victim. They'll use techniques of mind control, making the victim feel like she's crazy or putting her in a double bind. I mentioned one earlier. Yes, sure, go and see your sister. Oh, you chose to see your sister over me. And if you really loved me, you wouldn't have gone to see your sister. You would have stayed with me. And so these are very confusing and unsettling kind of binds that abusers can put their victims into. Gaslighting, I think most people are probably familiar with that term, but it's leading a victim to believe that she's crazy and leading other people to think that the victim's crazy. So that could be friends, it could be family members, it could even be the boss, the victim's boss. And it can be done very openly, and it can be done in subtle ways, like calling friends of the victim and saying, hey, have you noticed that Susie seems to be a little off lately? I'm concerned about her. Please just let me know if you see anything. And so then, people begin to wonder and begin to look to see if there's a problem. There's something called provoke and record, which I'm going to be talking about in greater depth later. But this is where an abuser would deliberately provoke the victim into doing something which is out of character for her, yelling, throwing things, threatening, and recording it, and then with the intention of using it against her later in court. I'll be looking at that more later. And Darvo, which I'll also be speaking about a little more later. Some of you may be familiar with, and it's a current really common technique of domestic abusers to deny that they're abusive, to attack the victim and claim that the victim is in fact the abuser, and reverse the victim and offender. So they are saying, hey, I'm actually the victim here. And sometimes judges and sometimes police get confused. Well, who actually is the abuser? And maybe one person has been victimized over 10 or 15 years and has never called the police. Maybe she's always lied when she's gone to the emergency room and said that she fell, or that she hit her head on a cabinet, rather than saying that this is what the abuser did to her. But the abuser may have a 12-second video where it looks like maybe she tossed something off a table or threw something, and it looks like she's the violent one. So the job of judges and juries and police becomes more complicated here. Abusers commonly micromanage and set rules. They may have rules about time, how the victim is supposed to spend her time, about how she's supposed to dress, more sexy, less sexy, only sexy abusers around, how and when and how often she's allowed to wash herself, paint her nails, wash her hair, get a haircut, the food she's allowed to eat, how she's allowed to use the toilet, what sites she can go to on the internet, what friends she can hang out with. They may need to have to be approved by the abuser first. How she should talk, how she should cook, how she should clean. And this is way beyond sort of ordinary kind of preferences that, one person, well, they really like the toilet paper, coming from the back or from the front. I'm talking about something different from kind of ordinary preferences. This micromanaging and setting rules comes with the either explicit or implicit message: if you don't do what I want here, you're going to be in trouble. So there's an element of fear there. Commonly, a part of this is that the abuser defines what it means to be in a relationship or married or love each other. So, if you really loved me, you wouldn't go out with your friends unless I'm there. If you were really dedicated to me, you would save all your money to pay for me to do X. And sometimes people who are being victimized feel like they have no choice but to go along, or they go along because of the authority that the abuser assumes. After separation, and we will be talking about post-separation abuse, the abuser can micromanage the children's activities, their care, their schooling, as a way to control their victim. They may not be able to control her directly in the same way, so they can use parenting as a way to control and manipulate her. Stalking is a serious problem in coercive control. And again, not all of these techniques of control, these tactics are going to appear in every situation. But I just love this illustration. It's by Liz Banish, as are many of the illustrations in this presentation. And this is really what stalking feels like, that you're attached to somebody that nobody else can see, but they're always there. It always feels like they're there. Stalking is a series of behaviors directed at a specific person, designed to make that person feel fear. Now, one of the tricky things about stalking is a lot of times for people outside the relationship, they don't understand it. So let's say a woman comes to her car from the supermarket and there's a heart on a piece of paper on the windshield, and she knows that her abuser left it there for her. Other people might think, oh, that's romantic or that's sweet. She knows that it means she's being tracked and followed. One woman who had gotten divorced and had protective orders against her ex, every month he would put $6.66 in her bank account, which I guess is a number that's supposed to symbolize, I don't know, the devil or something like that. And she experienced that as a real threat and stalking, but there was no way she was able to make that stop. Stalking can happen within relationships and outside relationships. And going to court can be terrifying for someone who's being stalked. Stalking occurs in several spheres. The person may feel like they can't go out alone or not be allowed to go out alone while they're in the relationship. The abuser may search the computer, the phone, the car, the clothes, the drawers, the diary, the receipts, the GPS. And a lot of times, victim survivors don't even know the different ways in which they're being tracked. The person could be followed, or other people could be following them. You see this a lot with teenagers, is that an abuser will shoot out a message to 40 friends saying, hey, tell me if you see Carmela. I'm looking for her. And then, 40 people are essentially tracking her for the abuser. They don't know what they're doing. They don't understand the role that it plays in the relationship. Stalking is unpredictable and has no clear ending, which is part of why it's so frightening. 10 years after a relationship is over, when both parties have remarried, in the middle of the night, the abuser may be out there throwing stones at the window of the victim just to kind of say, I'm still here. It's very scary. Technology facilitated abuse is a huge category. It includes stalking the person through technology, on all the different, social media, stealing their identity, which of course is illegal, ruining their reputation through social media by posing as them or by spreading rumors about them, doxing, manipulating smart homes. Very often, men know how to operate smart homes, the thermostat and the alarm and so on that are connected to technology. And very often women are willing to let the man handle it. But then if they separate and all of a sudden her alarm goes on in the middle of the night, or the heat goes on in the middle of the summer, that could be the abuser making that happen. Distributing sexual images or threatening to distribute sexual images is huge and very, very difficult for survivors to deal with. Often abusers, and often early in the relationship, will persuade the person who they will later victimize to send them a photo, or they will take videos, or photos even without permission, and then distribute them or threaten to distribute them, threaten to send them to bosses, family members, members of religious institutions. Verbal abuse is a big category of abuse in coercive control. It can include belittling, so telling the person that, you know, what they need or want isn't important, criticizing, humiliating, threatening, and verbal abuse in sexual acts, among others. Now, some people might think, well, verbal abuse, it's just words, you know, words don't break bones or whatever. But for a lot of survivors, the verbal abuse was really the worst part because it eroded their sense of themselves. It can lead people to feel very confused about who they are and what they're about, and it can lead to a real lack of confidence. Verbal abuse is not simply nastiness. So some people, you know, some people in relationships occasionally are nasty to each other. They might call each other names in a moment of anger. Verbal abuse is something much worse. The victim is isolated, and that makes her more vulnerable. If somebody's not isolated and their partner one day in frustration, you know, calls them a name, well, it's not ideal, but it happens. But they have other friends, they have neighbors, they have family, and so they basically have a good sense of themselves, which can withstand that name calling, even though, you know, they'll try to get the name calling to stop. But somebody who's isolated by coercive control doesn't have that supportive network. And so they may come to believe what the abuser is saying, that they're a nag, that they're impossible, that nobody could ever love them, that they're crazy, and so on. The verbal abuse is severe or it's very frequent. And it's not just when the abuser is mad. The abuser uses it to suppress conflict and restrict the freedom of their partner. Intimidation is used in coercive control. There's all kinds of ways that abusers intimidate their partner, by stomping around, by slamming doors, by slamming cabinets, by throwing things, by hurting pets or threatening to hurt pets, by driving fast and recklessly, by breaking objects. I worked with a woman who was an immigrant, and as was her husband, and she had some precious objects that she had brought from her home country, which she was not able to visit with any kind of frequency. And he had those lined up on the dining room table. And if she ever tried to defy him or wasn't completely obedient, he had a special hammer that he'd use, and he would just take it and smash the objects. And you know, he was able to control her in this way. What I call suicidal noise, and I'll get back to suicidality soon, but using threats of suicide or talk of suicide to intimidate the partner to prevent them from leaving. And verbal threats of things, you know, could be lethal threats, you know, no one will ever find your body. It could be threats regarding the children. I'm going to take away the children. You won't have them anymore. It could be threats of physical harm. I'll leave you homeless. You know, there's many ways, explicitly and implicitly, that abusers threaten their victims. And it creates a situation of fear, of living in a situation of fear. And children also feel that fear. So let's look a little bit more at suicidality. Suicidal threats, implicit or explicit, in other words, I'm going to kill myself, would be an explicit threat, or you're never going to see me again and you won't know what happened, isn't more of an implicit threat. It holds victim survivors hostage. They feel like they can't end the relationship, they can't get away, because then they feel like they would be responsible for the abuser's death. It's a communication of violent intent. I'm going to shoot myself is a communication of willingness to use violence. Research shows that men who threatened or attempted suicide were 133% more likely to kill their female partners than other domestic abusers. In other words, male domestic abusers who threatened or attempted suicide were much more likely to kill their victims than other domestic abusers. So any expression of suicidality on the part of a domestic abuser should be taken very seriously by law enforcement, by the courts, by victims, by advocates, and so on. What's the relationship between physical violence and coercive control? Physical violence is one tactic. As I said, it's just one tool in the abuser's toolbox, and not all abusers use physical violence. The more sort of sophisticated the abuser is, the less likely they are to use physical violence, and they use these other tactics instead. The physical violence is often mild but frequent. So the abuser may push or slap or grab or shake or pull the hair of their partner or be purposely rough during sex. And all these things may be things that the victim, is not going to call the police about. It's not going to tell their therapist about. It's just, it's just part of the fabric of her everyday life. But those are physical assaults. I have seen a lot of accidental hurting where an abuser will walk into a room and stomp on the foot of the victim and say, "Oh, excuse me, I didn't see you." But it happens again and again. Or will, accidentally lean on her too hard during sex and give her a black and blue mark. But it happens again and again. Or close the trunk on the head of a victim and knock her out. And again, it's called an accident. So now I've taken to asking people when I'm working as an expert witness if they have had repeated accidents in which the abuser ended up hurting them. 95% of domestic violence assaults are mild. So if you ask only about broken bones, you're going to miss those assaults. In other words, 95% of the time, we're talking about pushing and slapping and grabbing and shaking, and that may form the fabric of everyday life. The more severe assaults are much less common. In 40% of couples with domestic violence, the abuser assaults the victim several times a week or every single day. Again, those may be those mild assaults, but they would certainly wear a person down and cause them to live in fear. So those of you who are questioning or evaluating victims, you're going to get different answers if you say, is there physical abuse? Or did he physically abuse you? From, does your partner hurt you? Or has your partner hurt you? Or is there hurting in your relationship? Because a lot of times somebody who's being even victimized physically will not put it into the category of physical abuse, but they know that they're being hurt. Okay, so this is a very difficult but a really important topic. Strangulation, smothering, or quote unquote choking. I'm putting choking in quotes because that's the term that most people use. But professionals say, well, you choke on a piece of meat. If somebody else is causing you not to be able to breathe, then that's strangulation. Or if they're putting something over your mouth, whether it's a hand or a pillow, that's smothering. But because people use the word choking, I think it's important to say that word. Strangulation and smothering are very, very dangerous. Even a partial strangulation can lead to lasting physical and psychological damage. Among the problems it can lead to, brain damage, pneumonitis, miscarriage, heart attacks, and delayed death days or even weeks after the assault. I know women who've been strangled, not to unconsciousness, but they've been strangled and can no longer eat solid food because it's affected their swallowing. The external bruising may be slight, especially on that first day, and victims often discount the experience. They think they're not really hurt. They fail to document the abuse. Sometimes law enforcement fails to document the abuse. A lot of times medical examiners fail to document the abuse, and few victims seek medical attention. If they're asked how long, if they did pass out and they're asked how long they passed out, or if they're asked how long the strangulation lasts, they may say, I don't know, 10 seconds, 30 seconds. I mean, the sense of time is not going to be accurate. So anybody who has an interest in this topic, and I really hope everyone does, I encourage you to look at the Training Institute on Strangulation Prevention. And if you know somebody who's been harmed by strangulation or choking, speech and language pathologists are probably going to be the right people to intervene and to give them help. Strangulation is attempted murder. Choking during sex is particularly hard for victim survivors to define and to discuss. It's considered, I don't even know how to say it, trendy or something. A lot of times women feel like they can't resist it, they can't object to it, but it is still frightening, it's still potentially dangerous, and I don't want to, let me just say that it's still potentially dangerous, and I would discourage anybody from engaging in this. All the victim survivors who I have spoken to who have had this happen have said that they didn't want it. Whether they felt they were okay objecting to it or not is another story, but it made them afraid. Let's look at coercive control and homicide. In 20% of domestic violence homicides, the murder was the first act of physical violence, but there was coercive control. This is really important. So when we look at how dangerous a situation is, yes, it's important to look at, is there access to an arm, and what, has a weapon been used in the past? But coercive control is also an indicator of possible domestic violence homicide. Let's look at sexual coercion, violence, and degradation. This is also a really hard topic. Abusers will typically expect sex on demand. That is, they expect sex when they want it. They may physically force sex. They may coerce the person into being willing to have sex with others for money. They may engage in painful and humiliating acts that the victim feels like they can't resist, or doesn't know how to resist, or tries to resist and is unable to. They may record sex to use it for coercion later. And I have seen abusers who were able to get their victim to say yes to that. And I've also seen situations where abusers recorded sex without any kind of permission from the victim, and then used it to say later, I'm going to send this to your mom, I'm going to send this to your boss. I know a situation where an abuser sent the judge tapes that he had recorded during sex the day before that he was going to court. Strangulation during sex, as I said, is frightening and dangerous. Drugging for sex. I did a webinar along with a nurse that you can find at domesticshelters.org on drugging in intimate relationships. And one of the ways, and I also wrote a piece on that, and sometimes that drugging happens for sex. People may not be aware of it. I've worked with multiple women who thought they had drunk too much. They'd had too much alcohol. They thought they had passed out. And as we explored the situation more, it seemed pretty clear that no, the one drink they had was not enough to make them pass out, and probably their partner had drugged them. So there's so much more of domination that happens through sex. Intimate partner sexual violence is a huge and important topic, and I hope that you'll keep learning more about it. It's very, very hard for survivors to talk about, and I talk with people about very difficult topics regularly, and this is really probably the most difficult one. Victims of intimate partner sexual assault are often seen as bad victims. They can be very frustrating for law enforcement. They may go to the police with what happened to them and then afterwards say it didn't happen. Why? Well, they're still accessible to the partner. The partner may be threatening their children, their home, their jobs. They may report multiple sexual assaults by the same partner, which can be, of course, very frustrating for law enforcement and sometimes difficult to understand. They may have complicated mental health profiles due to the abuse, and they may think that they're the problem, that it's because they are not willing to have sex enough, or because they're too vanilla, which is what their partner keeps telling them, that it in some way forces their partner to assault them. Of course, it does not force their partner to assault them. But intimate partner sexual violence can produce a real trauma response that is really important for survivors to get treatment for. So, what are some of the effects of coercive control? Among others, the victim may feel fear, may be isolated, may experience anxiety, panic, and social phobia, maybe for the first time, may have low self-esteem, may have all kinds of different health problems which are associated with trauma and repeated intimate trauma, especially. They may have trouble concentrating. They may feel depressed. They may feel a lot of shame and blame themselves for what's happening. They may have trauma symptoms and they may kind of feel unhinged, like they're coming apart. All I can say is that when they're in safety, they begin to recover. And that's really where we need to focus. So it's really important for law enforcement, fire department folks, medical folks to remember that the state that a person is in when they're living with trauma or just out of a traumatic situation, they're not going to be in the same state in a year. They will look very, very different. Coercive control can produce homelessness, as even people who own their homes are pushed out of their homes by the abuser. It contributes to addictions as people try to cope with their trauma, or abusers deliberately push their victim to take drugs and alcohol. It can cause people to lose their jobs. It can cause victims to be suicidal. It can cause victims to commit homicide against their abusers. It can make people unwilling to cooperate with legal proceedings because of the fear they feel and all different kinds of factors. Coercive control can contribute to harm to children, which we'll be talking about now, including the death of children. And it can create criminal records for victims whose abusers entrap them into committing illegal acts. So coercive control, a big problem. Let's talk briefly about gender and intimate partner abuse and coercive control. I've been generally using the male pronouns to describe an abuser and female pronouns to describe a victim. But as I've said, abusers and victims can be of any gender. So there's a myth about gender parity, and I'm happy to talk about the research, but I'm not going to go into it right now. During the question and answer, we can talk about that if you'd like. There's a myth that women are just as violent against men as men are against women in intimate relationships, but that's just not true. If you see women violent against male partners, it's usually isolated incidents. So she pushed him once, she slapped his face twice over the course of 15 years. Shouldn't happen, but that's usually what it is, isolated. It's uncommon that women will seriously injure their male partners unless it's at a moment where they feel that they or their children are facing serious injury. Rarely does women's violence against men produce chronic fear. Research shows that when women are violent against men, it's usually in self-defense or it's play. So if they're asked, have you ever slapped your partner? They might say yes. But then when researchers examine, well, in what context did you slap your partner? Oh, he was, we were just fooling around and he said something and I gave him a little smack on the cheek. In other words, it wasn't inducing fear or out of domination. If there's a homicide of a woman against her male partner, it's usually after years in which she has been abused or she's defending the children. Now, this is not always true, but this is usually the case of women's violence against male partners. Men's violence against female partners is usually a continuous pattern. So if it's pushing and slapping, it happens repeatedly, regularly, not just once or twice. Serious injury is more likely of men against women. Women are more likely to live in chronic fear. Usually the violence of men against their female partners is part of an aggressive or controlling pattern. And if there's a homicide, so if a man kills his female partner, it's usually after years of abusing her. So why are men more likely to use coercive control over women in heterosexual relationships? Part of it is the way we're socialized. Children are trained in their gender roles. So boys learn to get on top, be in charge, and get their needs met. And girls generally learn to please and take care of others' well-being. Now, you might look at this and say, well, that's really old-fashioned. That's not what happens now. But I would urge even the most feminist among us to look at our families and see if we are raising boys to take care of the feelings of people around them as much as we're raising girls to do that. Are we raising boys to go get their uncle a glass of water and to pick up their cousin who's crying in the same way that we're raising girls? I hope so, but that's really not most of what I see. Certainly, some women are bossy and mean, but typically they don't have the power to coercively control their male partners. And there's some research showing that when men are involved with a controlling women, they are more likely to leave. They feel less threatened because of women's generally smaller size, less practice fighting, and men are much more likely to use sexual violence against women than women against men. I'm certainly not saying that women are never coercively controlling of men. They absolutely are, and I have worked on cases where that was the case, but it's less common. Girls are also traditionally raised to value romance and a happy home above all else. Women are raised to sacrifice for love and family. So if there's a problem with the family or the relationship, they're raised to sacrifice themselves to try to make it work. Women often see the success of their relationship as being their responsibility. And so if there's something wrong, they're going to fight to try to make it better rather than saying, I've done enough. It's time to leave. Some men, not most men, take advantage of these romantic ideals. And these romantic ideals can really be a trap. As I said, coercive control does exist in same-sex relationships, and all genders can inflict it and suffer from it. So let's look at some of the ways that domestic abusers can flip the script. And I see this more and more, and it can be very confusing for police. It can be very confusing for court personnel. It can be very confusing for attorneys who are trying to figure out, wait, but who's the abuser? We talked about DARVO earlier, deny, attack, reverse, victim, and offender. So this is where domestic abusers say that they were in fact victimized. The domestic abuser may file for a protective order when in fact it's the victim who needs one. But that can create a very confusing sequence of events for then the courts to have to deal with. Provoke and record, which I described earlier, where a domestic abuser will deliberately provoke their victim and then either like have a cell phone out and be recording it, or maybe they have cameras hidden in different places where they're recording it. And may have 10,000 hours of video of things that have happened in the home, but they're going to select that 11 seconds, which they think works to their advantage in court. I have seen abusers who get the victim survivor arrested, and law enforcement needs to remember that scratches may be more visible than other forms of assault. So for instance, a police officer comes to a home, is called to a home, and let's say the abuser has scratches on his face. And he says, she attacked me, she came at me, she attacked me. Well, it's very important to separate those two and ask the person who allegedly attacked alone what actually happened. And if she says, he held me up against the wall, say, what do you mean by that? Against the wall by my neck. In other words, she was being strangled, and she reached out in any way she could to protect herself. Victims may have injuries on their breasts, on their genitals, that they're not willing to talk about. And abusers often pride themselves on leaving no footprints, leaving no fingerprints. And so it's very important to ask questions to ascertain who is the real abuser. I've also seen situations where abuse survivors, victim survivors, will tell the abuser, I'm done, I'm out of here, I can't deal with this anymore, I want to get a divorce or I want to get separated. And the abuser will either consult with a lawyer or go to websites and learn what the abuser needs to do to dominate the situation further. So they may turn on the sweetness and the light and stick around becoming a super dad and trying to gather evidence against their victim. I see this happening all the time these days, and it's very, very concerning. The fields of child abuse and domestic violence are quite separated. They have different funding streams, different organizations, different profiles of who is in these two fields. But the separations are really quite artificial. In about half of families where there's intimate partner abuse, there's also child abuse. And in about half of families where there's child abuse, there's also intimate partner abuse, including coercive control. So where you see one, look for the other. Intimate partner abuse and child abuse go hand in hand. The rates of child abuse and neglect in families with intimate partner violence is 4 to 15 times higher than in other families. Now, 4 to 15 times may seem like a big range, and it is a range, but it is a big range, but it depends on how these definitions are established. Exposure to coercive control is in itself traumatizing, even if there are no other forms of child abuse. The reality of most child abuse and domestic violence, and I am not saying all child abuse and domestic violence, but most child abuse and domestic violence is that there is a man who is abusing his female partner and the children. And I think it's important to acknowledge that. Again, this is not true 100% of the time, but this is most of the time what we're looking at. There's some really great books that illuminate this. Evan Stark's new book, Children of Coercive Control. The book with one of the co-authors is from Massachusetts, Margaret Drew, Challenging Parental Alienation, and Coercive Control in Children and Mothers' Lives by Emma Katz, which is based on a relatively small study in the UK of children and mothers who escaped from a coercive control relationship. These are all 3 books are very helpful. Experiencing the abuse of a parent harms children. It's destabilizing to them if there's yelling, physical violence, just uncertainty, discomfort, name calling. It's very destabilizing to children. It can be difficult for them to concentrate in school as they try to figure out what's happening at home and may feel guilty for leaving home. Too much mental space is occupied by the abuse. What's going to happen and what's going to happen if? And what can I do? And what should I do next? And should I tell someone? The children feel like they have to use their energy to make sure their mom and their siblings are safe. Children feel guilty, and a lot of times their worries become physical ailments. Some of you may be familiar with ACEs, the adverse childhood experiences, which are associated with physical illness in adults. But children also suffer stomach aches, headaches, migraines, symptoms of anxiety, encopresis, enuresis, and so on. Exposure to domestic violence harms children. Children know. A lot of times intimate partner violence survivors and abusers will say, oh, the children have no idea. We always fight after the kids are in bed, or we always go into the basement to fight. But children know. Research shows that if you ask the children, they'll say yes, they know something's going on. They see signs of it, even if they don't see the abuse itself. Even mild episodes of one person behaving poorly to the other, dominating the other, provoking fear in the other. Even those episodes are traumatizing for children. What are those dynamics teaching children about the world? What are those dynamics teaching children about the people who should be caring for them? What do violent episodes teach children about the world and what you should do if you really want to get your way? So these are pictures of my grandchildren, and I'm just using them to just show how little and tender children are, and to emphasize that exposure to intimate partner abuse is bad for kids' brains. Okay, it harms their brains to be exposed to intimate partner abuse, and that can have lifelong effects. I'm going to tell you about a specific story. This is a quote from a client used with permission. She said, "He loved to beat me when I was holding the baby. One day he was hitting me with a belt when she was in my arms. The belt hit her and she turned all purple, screaming." So in this instance, we see a child who's physically harmed by the abuse that was directed at the mother. But what happened the next morning is even more disturbing. So the next morning, the mom was chopping, vegetables, chopping something at a cutting board. And the abuser, the child's father, was sitting behind her and made some kind of remark, some kind of crack about what had happened the night before. And she turned around with the knife and said, "If you ever," and I don't know exactly what she said, but she had the knife in her hand. He was recording that, okay? Provoke and record, and use that to make the claim, in this case successfully, that she was a domestic abuser and that they were both guilty of domestic abuse. Now, that didn't happen in Massachusetts. I'd like to think that it wouldn't happen in Massachusetts. I'm not sure if that's true. But here we can see some of the ways that children can get caught up in intimate partner violence and coercive control situations. People who abuse their children are not good parents. I'm not saying they won't have good parenting moments. They might, but they can't be good parents. Let me tell you why. They prioritize their own needs above others' needs. They organize the family life around themselves rather than around what the children need. They lack empathy. If they didn't lack empathy, they wouldn't be able to use coercive control against their partners. So they do lack empathy, and the intimate partner abuse shows that they lack empathy. They're not going to turn around and become a different person when they're children, with their children. They're still going to lack empathy. They might be nice sometimes, but they're going to lack empathy. They violate their partner's boundaries, and they are going to violate their children's boundaries as well. They may look good when the children are young, when it's easier to dominate the children. But problems are going to occur when the children no longer agree to the total control of the abuser. Abusing a partner is a parenting choice. Abusing a mother hurts her children. She's deprived of the resources she needs to succeed. Whether it's during the relationship when she may not have access to the money, to the time at work, to the friendship circle, to the network, to the connections she needs to get ahead, or if it's post-separation when she's putting all of her economic resources into fighting court battles. But this also hurts her children. Living in fear makes it harder for her to parent. The time and energy are focused on appeasing the abuser rather than on all the other things it could be focused on related to the children. Abuse wears a person down. And then there's what Evan Stark describes as the battered mother's dilemma, where abuse victims are made to choose between their own well-being and the child's. So, for instance, a court might order the domestic violence victim to bring the children to the abuser's home. Or the court might order the abuser to pick up the children at her home where she feels unsafe that he's standing at the door. And yet she's forced to comply, which also puts herself at risk. And these kinds of things happen again and again. So let's talk for a minute about calling the Department of Children and Families about domestic violence. And I'm going to just read to you, and forgive me for that, but I'm going to read to you from a handout of the Department of Children and Families, from the Department of Children and Families about how to handle domestic violence situations if you're a mandated reporter of child abuse. Domestic violence is defined as a pattern of coercive controlling behaviors that one person exercises over another in an intimate relationship. Not every situation involving domestic violence merits intervention by DCF. Mandated reporters should carefully review each family's situation and identify any specific impact on the children when considering whether or not to file a 51A report with DCF. In some cases, a report may create additional risks for the caretaker and the children. If possible, discuss the filing of a report with the caretaker first and address the potential need for safety planning. So in other words, if a school counselor or a teacher or a doctor feels like they need to file with the Department of Children and Families because of something the abuser is doing, it would be best to talk to the victim about it first so she can know what's coming and engage in some safety planning with the local domestic violence agency or whatever it is she needs to do to assure her safety. This is, again, still from the handout of the Department of Children and Families. A report is more likely necessary if the following higher risk circumstances are current concerns. The alleged perpetrator threatened to kill the caretaker, children, or self, and the caretaker fears for their safety. The alleged perpetrator physically injured the child in an incident where the caretaker was the target, like that hitting with the belt that actually hit the child. The alleged perpetrator coerced the child to participate in or witness the abuse of a caretaker. Now, we often see domestic abusers abusing verbally, physically, and in every way their victim in front of children. The alleged perpetrator used or threatened to use a weapon, and the caretaker believes that the perpetrator intended or has the ability to cause harm. So, in other words, there are not every, the Department of Children and Families does not need to be called every time that there's a suspected incident of domestic violence. I have seen the Department of Children and Families be vitally important for helping children and moms who are in situations of domestic violence. I've also seen harm come. So I hope that mandated reporters will be thoughtful about how they make reports and try to think of this as something they're doing along with the person who's being victimized, the adult who's being victimized. Many victims leave abusers for the children's sake. They may stay with the abuser initially for the children's sake, thinking that it's giving their children some protection, children need a father, and so on. But often they will leave for the children's sake when they realize that it's harming the children to be exposed to that kind of abuse. Victims come to recognize that their partner is harming their children, and after separation, children remain a site of control, and abusers are able to control their victims in new ways through the children post-separation. There's so many ways in which post-separation abuse occurs. I'll just mention a few. Abusers may purposely disrupt the established visitation schedule, earlier, later, changing it, not sticking to what is planned in ways that disrupt the victim's life, using visitation to access the victim, even telephone calls or video calls with the child, using that to give messages to the victim, threatening to harm the child, threatening to run away with the child or to take the child from the victim through court, neglecting the child on visits. Just recently, someone told me about how the child's father would not change the children if they had toileting accidents when they were with him, even though the mom had supplied change of underwear and pants and so on, but the abuser would just not change them. I've heard again and again about abusers who don't feed the children adequately on visits or who leave the children alone, unaccompanied. Refusing to give the children access to the other parent on phone calls or video calls as mandated by court. Trying to fracture the mother-child relationship by bad-mouthing their victim to the children. Making up stories about the victim, saying it's her fault that they separated, saying that she's no fun, and so on. Sometimes abusers will deliberately harm their children to get back at their ex. David Adams, who's from our own Massachusetts Emerge, the first batter intervention program in the US, he founded it and is still a co-director of it. He coined the term spiteful disregard. And I can give you some examples of that. So for instance, popcorn is considered a choking hazard based on research in children up to the age of 4. So an abuser when the abuser has parenting time with a child who's 2 years old will deliberately be giving the child popcorn as the mom is viewing it, knowing that it's a choking hazard, but to get her upset. Having the child wear high heels when they go to an amusement park so they could sneak into rides that they're actually too short to go on safely. Teaching a child to use drugs. Deliberately feeding a child who has digestive problems foods that they should not be eating. These are things that they're doing to spite the other parent, but they're actually harmful to children. Having the child miss school, blocking medical treatment or psychotherapy for a child. Abusers try to alienate children from their protective parent. Abusers weaponize children to hurt the other parent. They use the children as spies. What's your mom doing? Who does she speak with? Where did you go? What did you do? They use the children as hostages, refusing to give them back when they're supposed to. They use them as pawns in the courts. They use them to steal things from the parents' home. I know a mom who locks up things in her house. She closes off one room in her house when her children visit because she fears that her oldest daughter is taking things to the father. Pitting the child against the other parent, drawing the child into the abuse. So getting the child to also say nasty things or do unkind things to the victim. Using the child to coerce the other parent, telling the child, tell mommy that you want me to live there again. Tell mommy that you want X, which is really a manipulation of the children. Rewarding the child for rejecting or disrespecting the other parent. Convincing the child that the other parent is wrong or bad or immoral. One abuser I know refuses to use the word mom or mommy when referring to the child's mother and instead uses the first name, which is confusing to a child, but also just wrong. They always had used mom or mommy in the past. What are some of the ways we can see children's symptoms from exposure to domestic violence and coercive control? Children may have traumatic arousal. They have trouble sitting still. They have trouble sleeping. It can look a lot like ADHD. And children can be helped through techniques such as learning meditation, learning mindfulness to still themselves, to calm themselves down. It may be that ADHD medication is not the right path. They may be emotionally numb to what's going on around them. Just seem kind of out of it. They may have memories, intrusive memories that come up when they don't want them to, and that interfere with their ability to be present in school, with friends, with family. They may have a low tolerance for stress so that they explode either in anger or in sadness, crying, when things happen that wouldn't upset most children. They may experience depression. They may experience anxiety. They may have low self-esteem. They may withdraw. You can see traumatic stress reactions. They jump when there's a loud noise or when somebody reaches towards them. They may abuse substances when they get older. They may fail out of school. School just doesn't seem as important. For other kids, school is their outlet, and so they do really well. They may behave in aggressive ways. They may behave in delinquent ways when they get older. Children, even young children, may express suicidality. It's a way of asking for help, and it's a way of expressing their distress. They may enter into violent relationships when they're older, either as the abuser or as the abused. All right, let's look at another form of coercive control, litigation abuse. It can be defined as legal actions to exert power, to force contact and financially burden an ex-partner. There's the constant stress of going to court, which requires taking time off work, arranging transportation and childcare, and having to confront an abuser face-to-face in court. I participated in a legislative hearing on proposed coercive control laws, which we'll talk about more later, and proposed litigation abuse laws in Massachusetts last spring. And some of the absolute most heartbreaking testimonies came from people who were subject to litigation abuse. Could be dozens, could be hundreds of hearings that they were forced to go to, ways in which they were forced to defend themselves in court. Huge waste of time, huge waste of money, and a very powerful form of abuse. So this can be vexatious or frivolous litigation about things that don't matter, just to bring them into court, to force them to lose money, knowingly, falsely reporting that the abuse victim has abused the child, falsely claiming that they're being abused by the partner, DARVO, which we discussed earlier, filing constant motions to vacate protective orders, and so on. Fighting over custody and property, where even they may know they won't win, but they just want to keep bringing their victim back to court. Making claims of parental alienation, which we'll talk about in a little bit. Litigation abuse affects children deeply. It leads to anguish in the children, and it leads to impoverishment of the protective parent, which is not good for kids. Litigation abuse can lead to uncertainty about schedules, instability in terms of schedules. Children may not be able to participate in activities because they could be in one person's house or another person's house. They may feel like pawns. They're caught in binds between the two parents. They may hesitate to express their wants and their needs because they know that things are so contested between the adults. They may have physical and psychological symptoms. Children suffer when the primary parent suffers. And there's some research showing that infants and toddlers with more time and overnights with non-custodial parent don't benefit or have a closer relationship with the non-custodial parent. So let's talk for a second about parental alienation, one term, and protective parenting, another term. Abusers routinely accuse protective parents of engaging in parental alienation. In other words, abusers who don't want to take responsibility for the fact that their child is afraid of them, their child has seen them yelling, their child finds them to be scary, will instead point the finger at the victim and say, the victim is alienating my children from me, being unwilling to take responsibility for the effects of their own actions. Parental alienation is not a mental health diagnosis. It's an unscientific and discredited idea that mothers routinely use allegations of abuse to brainwash their children against their fathers. I'm not going to say it never happens. It sometimes happens that mothers will alienate children from fathers. It sometimes happens that fathers will alienate children from mothers. But most of the time when parental alienation accusations are used by domestic abusers, it is just a manipulation. The accusations of parental alienation can discredit the protective parents' well-founded safety concerns for themselves and their children. With parental alienation syndrome, abusers use child custody litigation to claim to be victims, as we've looked at before today, and further attack the protective parents. And a statement from the National Council of Juvenile and Family Court Judges: it is often legitimate for the partner of an abusive parent to try to protect children from exposure to the abuse, or to try to secure his or her own safety from the abusive partner by limiting their partner's contact with the children. Abusers coercively control children too. They isolate children, they verbally abuse children, they gaslight and play mind games with children. They intimidate children, they physically abuse children, they may sexually abuse children. They impose unfair, unrealistic rules and restrictions on children. They withhold attention, a version of the silent treatment. They may exploit their labor. They may economically exploit children. A history of coercive control domestic abuse shapes what you see, whatever your role is. A victim may look unstable, overly emotional, crazy, paranoid, and out of control, depending on what moment you come onto the scene. A coercive controlling abuser may look calm, rational, and in control. The victim may seem to be making allegations that sound absolutely crazy. Like if a victim claims to be drugged by the abuser, that might sound crazy to you. Remember, this may be part of the abuser's gaslighting strategy to make the victim look crazy to others. So try to step back from the scene that you're seeing and know that there could be a variety of explanations. We need to change the law. We need to change the law from a focus on specific incidents of domestic violence, the punch, the kick, to a course of conduct crime of depriving another person of their liberty. Until those laws happen, then we can base criminal charges on harassment, kidnapping, rape, stalking, and other crimes. We should base custody proceedings on the best interests of the child and acknowledge the effects of coercive control. Europe and the UK have really led the way in terms of thinking about this, and I'm just going to briefly describe the laws in Europe and the UK. There are laws against coercive and controlling behavior in the UK and Scotland. The UK statute says making a person subordinate and or dependent by isolating them from sources of support, exploiting their resources and capacities for personal gain, depriving them of the means needed for independence, resistance, and escape, and regulating their everyday lives. These allow charges, criminal charges, based on a pattern and not just an incident. And these are criminal statutes in the UK and Scotland. This is not regulating being nice. These are extremes. In 2017, the Crown Prosecution Service did a report and found that 959 men and 1 woman had been convicted of coercive and controlling behavior in England and Wales. I think I'm not going to tell you about those specific cases. 5 US states have laws on coercive control. They all concern protective orders and child custody. In other words, the US does not have criminal laws on coercive control. I've worked as an expert witness on coercive control in 4 states that do have those laws and 15 states that don't. The states that do have those laws now are Colorado, Connecticut, Hawaii, Washington State, and California. And there are proposed laws in many other states, including Massachusetts. In Massachusetts, we have H1547, Senate 1077, an act to improve protections relative to domestic violence. It's being considered now. It adds coercive control and technological abuse as a basis for Chapter 209A abuse prevention restraining orders, and expands the statute of limitations on domestic violence cases to 15 years. The bill emphasizes that dangerous forms of abuse and control beyond physical or threatened violence impact survivors daily, and it allows civil courts to recognize these actions as a basis for a protective order. In other words, again, these are not criminal laws in the US or the proposed law in Massachusetts. These are civil laws. I have worked, as I said, in states that have these laws and in states that don't on family cases. And I have to say, these laws really do help. If a state doesn't have such a law, then the abuse victim has to, in a family court case, has to first make the case that what she was subjected to was criminal, and that therefore it counts as domestic violence. And therefore the judge should keep that in mind when making decisions about custody, let's say. In states that do have those laws, they don't have to make the case that coercive control is domestic violence. That's already in the statute. I have worked on a lot of cases where there were no coercive control statutes in the books yet, and been successful in cases that concerned the signing of documents, that if there was coercion, it invalidated those documents, including tax documents, prenuptial agreements, marital agreements about the children, and so on. There are cases where charges have been mitigated when victims have killed or injured their longtime abusers or committed other crimes under pressure from the abuser. Coercive control is incorporated into protective orders in many states. Coercive control is relevant to immigration issues. And coercive control is considered in custody cases too. It's just harder when there's no laws in a state that concern coercive control. A few more things I want to say. Sexism and structural racism worsen the effects of coercive control. Sexism and structural racism render women and people of color to have less money, to have less access to high quality jobs, which disempowers them in interpersonal relationships. They may have less access to transportation. People may accept male dominance as normative and therefore not challenge it. Women are more likely to be the primary parent, and that is certainly a choice that many women make. But it's also sometimes something that they don't have a choice about. Law enforcement, the courts, may fail to understand and protect victims of abuse because of sexist ideas and because of racist ideas. And a lot of people blame victims. I've seen situations where the victim had escaped with the children and was no longer living with the abuser, and people seem to still say, why didn't she get away? When in fact she had gotten away, and the abuser came, found her, and attacked her. Immigrant women are especially vulnerable to isolation and control, especially if they don't speak English, if they don't speak English well, if they are discriminated against, if they don't have documents. So what can you do if you know somebody who's being victimized by coercive control? There's a lot to say, and I'm just going to say a couple of things about it. It's important to avoid judging or controlling them. Don't tell them what they have to do. They have a better sense of their situation than you do. So offer to help, be patient, stay in touch, encourage them to contact their local domestic violence agency. A lot of times friends and family will say, just get away and get a restraining order. And that may seem like the obvious solution, but we know that the period of leaving an abuser is a very dangerous one. And so it's usually best for them to have help from their local domestic violence agency to figure out a safety plan in how to do that safely. You can ask people, what do you need? What can I do to help? It might be things you don't think of. It might be keeping their documents safe or agreeing to care for their pets while they seek shelter. What do you want to do? What's your biggest worry? Staying in touch is super important, even if it's not talking about the abuse. Going for a walk, getting together from time to time, letting them see that you like them and appreciate their good qualities. I do work as an expert witness. I just want to tell you briefly what an expert witness might be able to do for you. They can consult on complicated or new kinds of cases if you're being victimized, if you're an advocate or you're an attorney. Help clients speak about difficult matters. Clients will often talk to me about things that they were not comfortable speaking with their attorneys about. An expert witness can testify as a subject matter expert even without knowledge of the case, so can help explain what coercive control is, what financial abuse is, what post-separation abuse is to a judge. An expert witness can interview the client, conduct an evaluation with the client, review collateral materials, perhaps testify and write a report on coercive control, domestic violence in a client's life and its influence. And an expert witness may be able to do a peer review or rebuttal of reports by guardians ad litem, parenting evaluators, and so on. So the key takeaways: domestic violence does not always include physical violence. Coercive control domestic violence may not have physical violence and may be equally damaging to direct victims and to children. Coercive control is the term for the universe of domestic violence behaviors. Coercive control can explain much of what may seem puzzling in families to outsiders. Abused and controlled parents and their children should be treated as a unit facing a common threat. Okay, so be clear about who the threat is and who needs support in a given situation. A history of coercive control increases the risk of homicide. And the final point I'd really like to make is shared legal decision-making is not possible where one person controls the other. So where one person controls the other, that controlling person is not going to be open to true shared decision-making. And that couple is going to end up in court again and again as the protective parent tries to do what's best for their children, from psychotherapy to summer camp and so on. There's some organizations in Massachusetts. We are blessed by organizations that may be helpful to you. The Massachusetts Family Advocacy Coalition, which is working to improve the laws and the way the courts work around family issues. The League of Women Voters in Massachusetts is always working on behalf of children and families to change the law. There's a national safe parenting organization and One Mom's Battle. Those are both national organizations that a lot of people find helpful in terms of thinking about their own lives, getting support from others who are in a similar situation. I recommend Christine Cocciola's Protective Parenting Program. Christine is a doctoral level social worker in Connecticut who runs an online program for protective parents and also teaches psychotherapists, social workers, and attorneys about coercive control. In Massachusetts, we have a coalition called the TRACK Coalition, Together Rising Above Coercion Coalition, which is a coalition of state organizations that are working to improve the laws around coercive control in Massachusetts. Jane Doe Inc. is the state coalition of domestic violence organizations, always working for through their work through individual local domestic violence agencies and also as the state body that tries to improve the laws on domestic violence. Jane Does Well is a Massachusetts organization that works to help divorcing moms and provides a lot of solidarity as well as resources. And domesticshelters.org is a national organization. They have a website where you can find the address and contact information for your local domestic violence agency. They also have a lot of articles and resources on every aspect of domestic violence and coercive control. And I've written dozens of columns for them, which I hope you'll feel free to access. So there's my book on coercive control, the address of my website. Thank you so much for participating today. I am going to stop sharing my screen, and we have about half an hour for comments, questions, disagreements, and I welcome all of that. Thank you very much.